But when I was able to travel to Iraq's Kurdistan region and go to Erbil, I could put on civilian clothes, take my uniform off, and I went down to the citadel. And in the citadel, this is before coronavirus, in the citadel, I was able to walk around and get to enjoy some of the history and beauty of Erbil, but also meet some of the people. So I went to Mam Khalid's tea shop. It's very famous in Erbil citadel. And the proprietor there, Kak Muhammad, we would sit and talk about politics. I was amazed by their grit, their strength, and their morale after 6 or 7 years of continual fighting. And they each had personally lost close friends in the battle against ISIS, yet they get up, they put their uniform on every day, and they speak forcefully to the camera and confidently and competently about the operations being conducted by the SDF. Let's take a quick look at the history. When historians go back and look at the battlefield victories against ISIS, they'll see that the first major victory against ISIS was in Kobani with Kurdish-led forces, defeating ISIS at a time when the whole world thought ISIS was unstoppable. I mean, look what they've done. They've taken over most of Syria, 1/3 of the land of Iraq, taken down Mosul, the great city of Mosul, and there were black flags flying everywhere. But the Kurdish-led forces under General Masloum, with some support from the coalition with airstrikes, were able to fight and beat ISIS. There are many regional military forces at play in Syria and Iraq. And certainly some of those forces make decisions that slow down or distract from the mission to fight ISIS. And those forces have different agendas, and they are in some way acting out on those agendas because Syrian democratic forces are focused on the mission to defeat ISIS. There are regularly high-level talks that happen between these different nations, and I am aware of them because some of them I was aware of, where we would tell everybody, do not harm civilians. Reconsider what you're doing. When I arrived there in September and October, there was an effort to develop what was called a security mechanism zone, a safe zone between Ras Al Ain and Tel Abyad. And that was supposed to create space and time to prevent any sort of military operations from the north across into the south border of Syria. But it didn't. And there's humanitarian consequences for that. Tens of thousands of people had to move on no notice and go live with families or go live in camps. People had to close their businesses, the houses that they had worked for all of their life. Why? Because one nation decides that they feel unsafe and want to move into another nation for purposes that are not understood totally by me. So this was a sensitive issue it still continues to be a sensitive issue. Heck, it was a sensitive issue early on. I mean, look what happened to Afrin, and look what's happening now with operations in the Kurdistan region. But in Syria in particular, this was a distraction from our mission to defeat ISIS and partner with the Syrian Democratic Forces. But the US, we moved out of positions in the northwest of Iraq, or northwest of Syria, and Raqqa and Manbij, and Tabqa. We still have a presence, the American forces and coalition still has a presence in the northeast, in Hasaka and Deir ez-Zor. And I think the signals now from the current administration. Again, I'm not a spokesman, but it seems that we will continue to have our positions there in Northeast Syria. International community can do more for supporting the Syrian Democratic Forces in their mission of detaining ISIS fighters. The SDF can handle most of ISIS on the ground in the Badia Desert and in the Middle Euphrates River Valley. They've proven that. A larger concern is the health and humanitarian conditions. Imagine, as the world faces the coronavirus pandemic, if you have 100 men in a room where they're all laying with not even 6 inches apart, and the rest of us are talking about having 2 meters apart. The pandemic, if it gets in there, could really affect people. And even though they're ISIS fighters captured on the battlefield, we still have in the Western world a principle of safe humanitarian detention. So disease is always a threat there. And there's also the threat of uprisings, of violence. And the longer everyone stays there, the more these threats increase. I try not to put a crystal ball on anything in the future because if any of us were wondering what was going to happen in 2012, we would have never imagined that some group like the Islamic State would take over much of Iraq and Syria. It was on nobody's plans. So I don't predict the future too much. I don't spend too much time doing that. What I do know, what I try to focus on is the fact that the longer the Syrian Democratic Forces are together with General Mazloum as the leader, the better the coordination is across the military councils and governance councils, and from stronger coordination and partnership with Kurds and Arabs and Armenians and Syriac people, then there's likely to be longer regional stability throughout North and East Syria. And yes, I got a little bit emotional because it was an emotional time, and I wanted to stay, but I had to return back to my duties in the United States. And it was an emotional year. It was, I think, the most significant professional year of my career in the Army. I've been in the Army 24 and a half years, and my time in Iraq and Syria was the most professionally and personally impactful. And for some reason, there were some media in Turkey who attacked this. I don't know why they would attack me personally for having a good relationship with a group who was fighting ISIS, but they do. So my message to the Kurdish people is take from your history, look at your history, the history of Kurdish people. I look at some parallels to the history of Black Americans. It's a history that is one where it comes out of a history of oppression, where you're robbed of your language, you have your culture oppressed, but you still have to persevere. And you can draw on the strength of your ancestors to keep progressing forward toward freedom and prosperity, and the continued interest and friendship. And the last thing is, as a military person, I'm always impressed by the bravery on the battlefield and honor the martyrs and the fighters who are wounded, protecting their family and friends and villages from the tyranny of Daesh. Someday I'll return to Iraq's Kurdistan region to one of the universities there, and I would like to talk to students and lecture about American foreign policy and international relations and media relations.